the PFL Preview Show.
Mike Pendleton here, and it is time for PFL Chicago. We waste absolutely no time. You guys know how this gets done. It just happened for PFL Pittsburgh, and what a show it was. The first state show in the U.S. this year for the PFL was an absolute banger. It was a hit across the board, and there's only one man, part of the PFL, who can join me to talk about it. And we're both here in Chicago, the one and only Dan Hardy. Sir, how are you?
I'm really good, man. I'm enjoying being in Chicago. I've been running the Riverwalk, and it's a beautiful place, Chicago. It was a little bit cold when I first arrived, but it's settled down a bit now the fights are approaching.
One of my favorite things so far this week is my interview with Jenna Bishop, and she was like, "It is so cold. Why is it so cold here?" I'm like, "I don't know. I have no idea." But Dan, I make no decisions for the PFL, and obviously you are the voice of the PFL. And I just wanted to throw this at you. When we look at this card, is this not the perfect event to say it is veterans versus newcomers, the old fighting off the new? Let's set the stage for this card today.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've got a few of those fights where there's an undefeated young prospect that's has got a big fight in front of him. Obviously, Main and co-main are both in that situation. The other thing as well was we're stacked with female fights on this card as well. And that's another really interesting thing for me because the female divisions, I mean, they're electric right now. And obviously, Dakota is kind of leading the way in the women's flyweight, and the division is building around her. We had Ariane De Silva last week. Ariane Lipsky. I keep wanting to call her Ariane Lipsky. She had a great performance. We've got a Viviane Araujo on this card coming up as well, who a lot of people are keeping their eyes on. Jenna Bishop, as you just mentioned, and Paulina Wisniewska. We've got a really, really good selection of solid female flyweights on this card. So I think that's a big part of it. And also, we're going to be defining a bantamweight picture in the next couple of events as well. Obviously, the main event being a bantamweight fight with Sergio. He desperately wants to get himself in a position where he's the man to beat in the division. Taylor Lapalus has been calling for his name. He's matched on the card later in the year. But, we've also got, Mitch McKee. I'm speaking to him later today, and I've been binging on his fights and on his wrestling career. He is a phenom. He is a very, very dangerous individual. And you just think adding him into the bantamweight mix, along with some of the really strong wrestlers that are already here, man, it puts an additional amount of pressure on Sergio, I think, because he's going to have to pull something special out of the bag and stop this guy at the gates.
He absolutely is. And having talked to Sergio and Rafian Stotts, I'm curious your thoughts. So these are two guys who know their place in the division. They're at the top of the ranking. Sergio, former champion, and they know that there are so many newcomers chomping at the bit. What is the right way? Because we've seen the fight between Sergio and Rafian before. They both have admitted to me would rather not do that again. So what is the perfect path to opening up the bantamweight division that starts this weekend?
Look, in my opinion, we've got to get Taylor Lapalus in the mix. He was an incredibly strong fighter in the UFC. He left the UFC and came over and signed with us. He's looked very impressive since then. And in every single fight that he's had, he's grabbed the mic afterwards and he's been calling for Sergio. So for me, that's the one that makes the most sense. I think obviously the bantamweight division is kind of building in that direction, but for me, they're the two front runners right now. You've got Magomed and you've got Rafian Stotts, etc. But for me, Taylor Lapalus has made a really good argument for him getting himself a title shot. So, and the other thing as well is Taylor's a very, very technical fighter. He's got a real high fight IQ. And you put him in there against someone like Sergio, who's a dynamic striker that's very, very dangerous. I think that is going to be a fascinating battle between two guys, potentially the highest level bantamweights in the world. Just going back and forth and trying to figure out each other's game. That is a fight that has to be made at some point soon, in my opinion.
Absolutely agree with you. Now let's talk about the side of this that I don't think a lot of people think of when we look at this card. It is the veterans know what's going on. You talk about Josh Silveira and Jordan Newman in the co-main event. Josh Silveira told me, I know what this is. I know that I have to protect myself. And he said, Jordan Newman will be better because he fought me. And we'll see he's better after he fought me. He's not going to beat me. But from someone who's been inside the cage and has plenty of fight experience as a veteran, what does the challenge of young newcomers do to somebody who's been there, done that throughout their career?
The most difficult thing when you've got someone that's undefeated like Newman is you've got to convince them that they're going to lose, you know, and that could be a very difficult thing to do. Even if you win in the fight, even if you're putting a beating on them, like there's something about an undefeated record where they've not experienced that loss, and they kind of it's almost seems like it's a difficult thing to accept. On the other side, if you've got a fighter that they've had a bunch of fights and they've won and lost, sometimes you can see that internal battle in their mind, and I think that's probably the most interesting thing about this fight. Like Jordan Newman is, I mean, he's a big, powerful guy that knows his game very well, but still early in his career. Was he 8 fights into his career? He's grown the Dagestani beard. I don't know whether you saw that at the face-offs yesterday as well, but that looks like it's leveled him up in a little bit in his wrestling as well. And I think he's looking at Josh Silveira and going, okay, look, he's a strong wrestler. He's got great jiu-jitsu. He's got really unusual and dynamic striking. But if I can put him on the back foot, I can convince him that he's going to lose again. And on the other side, Josh Silveira has got all of the technical abilities, but he needs to find ways to kind of break Jordan Newman's spirit a little bit. Sap his cardio, defend his takedowns, threaten some submissions, land some shots, especially to the body that might sap his gas tank a little bit. I always think it's very difficult to hand someone that first loss on their record, and even though Josh Silveira's got all the skills to do it, self-belief goes such a long way in this sport, as you know.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about when we're looking at this fight card. Now, looking at this fight card, Dan, one of the things that I'm most excited about, and I may be one of very few, but it's absolutely what I love. And if John Martin's watching this, is exactly what you guys laid out the PFL for. If you look early on the card, you have Omar El Dafrari, a PFL MENA champion, a guy who literally rode the map for how you guys laid it out. It is PFL MENA, road to Dubai, and now he's on the global stage. He moved over from the MENA area here to Chicago, so this is in essence a home game for him. How much fun are you going to have seeing Omar this week and bringing him to the masses? And is this what the PFL set out to do?
Look, I mean, I think he's a good example of what the PFL have offered around the world. Being a PFL MENA champ and making a real statement as well when he won that title. He grabbed the mic and he called everybody in the division out. Like, his aspirations are to be an international star, and it's always interesting because you've got fighters that have already done it. Dakota has led the way as a PFL Europe champ. We've got a couple coming up in Sioux Falls. We've got Chizov coming up in Sioux Falls. We've got Florem Zendelli. That's main and co-main. We've got PFL Europe champs in a situation where they're taking on world level fighters, world class fighters, world champions, tournament winners. So I think what we're seeing right now, with the fighters coming out of the regional circuits, like Africa and MENA and Europe, and they're stepping onto the world scene, we're showing that they can hold their own, at least hold their own, if not surprise a lot of people and get some big wins. Like I think all of these fights are very interesting, and obviously Omar Dafwari is a big, powerful welterweight that has got enough skills to be able to compete with anybody in the division. But now he's landed in the US, and he's going to meet a different type of fighter here. And that was my experience when I first started coming over to the US. You're up against different types of athletes, different types of fighters, people that have been, on the mats in the wrestling room for most of their childhood, and that's really where the difference is when you reach the US and you start running into some of those fighters. That's the big wake-up call, and I think we're going to see the same thing with Zendelli against Logan Story coming up in Sioux Falls, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in a week or so. Zendelli's got to show a solution to the wrestling, and I think that Al Dafwari, that's his whole thing right now, is showing people that he can keep the fight standing, or at least keep the fight moving if it hits the floor. And that's really where the transition from the outside the regional leagues into the global scene makes the biggest difference for these people.
And I cannot wait selfishly again because I feel like this is what the promotion was made for. You mentioned obviously Dakota Ditcheva is the shining star in showing exactly what the PFL roadmap was and is, and she made the most of it. I cannot wait to see what Omar's next step here is in the PFL. Now we did our first one of the year of these shows before Pittsburgh, and so we have to look back a little bit because I'm kind of seeing a theme which I absolutely love, and I would love your take on it. We are setting the stage early, right? We saw the rankings come out. We know John Martin's, running the show now, but it's not like fights are just thrown together. We are seeing the middleweight division in Pittsburgh, everything, the stars aligned. We know where things are going from there. You mentioned the women's flyweight division. We're going to figure out a lot of questions and answers this weekend. How exciting, if you look back at Pittsburgh, is it to compare Pittsburgh to Chicago and the future being laid out in the PFL so quickly?
Look, I think it's really exciting the fact that we've got rankings now and the fighters can see where they fall in the division and who's above and who's below them. There was a whole conversation last week around who's next for Costello Van Steenis. Obviously, Johnny Eblen was the main event taking on Brian Battle, and in his mind, he is the clear number one contender, given the fact that it was just recently his belt. But then in the co-main, you've got Impa and Dalton. Both came into fight week with the intention of making a huge statement with their performance and putting themselves in line for a title shot. Like, I think the division's still wide open. I think obviously, Johnny Eblen is the next one for the title shot. That makes the most sense. It's going to be a really interesting rematch for him, given the fact that he's facing the only person that's ever beaten him. And on the other side, Costello is he's defending his belt for the second time, but this time against a person that was, all over him for the most part of their first bout. He was able to grab that rear naked choke in the closing seconds, but there's no doubt in Costello's mind how difficult it is to take on Johnny Eblen. So for me, that's an obvious one. But Impa's right up there in the conversation, and Dalton and Brian Battle, it wouldn't take them a fight or two to put themselves back in the conversation as well. And then Jordan Newman, Josh Silveira. Josh Silveira is a proven fighter, a veteran middleweight, as well as a veteran light heavyweight. He's been all over the place. If Jordan Newman makes a huge statement, that'd be 9-0 for his record, and he's another person that you just throw right into the mix at middleweight, and he could be a contender. So there's a lot going on, and there are other guys on the periphery as well in the middleweight division that at some point we're going to be seeing. I'm looking forward to Boris Hatangana making his middleweight debut because he's been absolutely smashing people at light heavyweight and heavyweight. As a middleweight, he's going to be a problem as well. So we've got lots of prospects coming through as well they're going to be champing at the bit and trying to get to Jordan Newman's place. So even he's not the prospect in the division. There's still someone younger and hungry to try and chase him down. For me, middleweight is very, very strong right now, as is bantamweight and lightweight. We've got a solid roster in all those divisions.
The special opportunities I get in talking to you is we get some real insight that we don't get anywhere else. So I'll just ask you this: you were on the broadcast desk with Dakota Ditcheva in Pittsburgh. Did you get the sense she's chomping at the bit? I'm guessing she'll at least be monitoring what is happening here in Chicago this weekend. What was the sense of Dakota's ready to get back in there for you?
Yeah, she's losing her mind, I'll be honest. And I don't think Dakota would mind me saying that as well, but like Dakota's whole life revolves around competing. And whenever she's not competing, she's in a bit of a holding pattern. Obviously she's been dealing with some injuries, she's been working through and around some injuries, but she's still in the gym, she's still getting the sessions in, and she's got her eyes on every single person in the division. She's not counting anybody out. I think she's excited about some of the recent signings that we've got, obviously with Ariane De Silva, and I just think there's some really interesting fights in her near future, and I think the fact that she's not in the mix right now is frustrating for her, especially because in her mind she's going to be able to beat everybody in this division and be the clear champion, and I think it must be frustrating for her to know that she's capable of that, but not be in that position right now. But I also think that's it's going to change her approach to fighting, isn't it? I think next time we see Dakota in there, she's going to be even more vicious and dangerous than she has been before, because she's not going to want to waste time, playing around and getting experience. She wants to cut through the competition and get to the title. So I think anytime that Dakota's cage side, I think it's only going to make her more motivated to get back in there. And it's also good to have her on commentary as well. It gives people a different insight when they're sitting cage side.
Yeah, I agree. And she's great at it, by the way. She's really good at it. Dan, one fight that's really kind of stuck out to me on this card that really nobody's going to talk about. And again, the thing I love about talking to you is you really bring a light and a respect to all the martial artists that we will see this weekend. And that's Jenna Bishop. Here's a girl who we just saw get all the way to the finals against Liz Carmouche. It did not go her way. She's in the middle of the rankings there in the flyweight division, but do you feel like this weekend here in Chicago, it sets up as a reminder, as Roy Jones used to say, y'all must have forgot that Jenna Bishop can remind the world that she's still one of the very elite fighters in this division?
No doubt. Jenna Bishop always looks better to me in the cage when she comes into fight week with a bit of a chip on her shoulder. When she's sat in fighter interviews with us and she's been kind of annoyed, just whatever. It doesn't really matter. She comes out and she fights with a venom that we, it certainly makes me a fan of her when she fights, because you can see her intention is to finish. It's to cause violence and do damage. And with her having such strong jiu-jitsu, like, she's always got that to fall back on. I mean, in her recent fight, she's been way more aggressive, and I think that's partly because her confidence in her striking's growing as well. She's very, very tough. She's very willing to mix it up, and knows that if at any point the fight hits the floor, she's almost always going to have the advantage on these opponents. She's right in the mix, of course, Jenna Bishop, and with the skills that she's got, with her her extreme level of grappling, she's with the right game plan, the right approach, she can put everybody in her wheelhouse and do damage. And get finishes. That's ultimately what she's looking for here. She wants to make sure that she's really cutting through the competition. I can't imagine that she's going to want to be fighting for another 5 years or so. I think she's going to want to make a fast run at the top and see what she can do in the next few years.
Well, Dan, you're a pro for a reason, so I apologize in advance that I'm going to butcher her last name, but Paulina Wisniewska, I mean, what a fighter she is, and she follows that same track as a Dakota Ditcheva. I just believe that the world is really going to see some of the highest level talent the PFL has had that nobody has ever heard of. And I think that also starts with Paulina. How excited are you for her to be on this card?
This is the opportunity that she's been wanting. Her coaches have been really excited about her coming over to the US to compete. She was very, very dominant in Europe as far as her technical abilities and her physicality, and you can see even since she won the European title, she's filled out as an athlete. There was a photograph a little while ago she posted, and she's in some ice lake in Poland and she's flexing, and she just looks so physically strong. She's really jumped up in her conditioning as well as in her technical abilities since we first saw her in the PFL cage. I think she looks at this division as she's the dark horse. I think she sees that, and I think that last loss that she was coming off was a real wake-up call for her that she can't count anybody out, no matter who they are, where they're coming from, and she's got to employ her game as best she can from the first round. Sometimes she allows fighters to get into the fights a little bit too much, and I don't think she needs to. I think she has the technical abilities to shut people out. Obviously, this is a very clear game plan for her. She needs to stay out of the clinch in this one. She needs to keep it standing and not engage in any kind of grappling exchanges. However, if she does, I think that's where we're going to see her strength and her calmness of mind. That she's got a huge fan base in Europe, particularly in Poland. And I think, a big win here interjects her right into the top of the rankings and makes conversations for potential fights with Dakota or Liz Carmouche or whoever else in the future. But you can't doubt Paulina Wisniewska's mind is the top of the division.
Dan, tomorrow I get you out of here. The big thing I love that we saw in the PFL in Pittsburgh was the fanfare, just how crazy the crowd got. Obviously, super behind Dalton Rossi, even though it didn't go his way. I think the PFL set a precedent for not only that event, but for the future. And while Sergio Pettis may be 90 minutes from Chicago, from Milwaukee, he calls it home. So I think we're starting to see a pattern where the PFL is identifying the top fighters that everyone wants to see, and they're going to their backyard yard. How big is this for the company to recognize that and really fall in line with let's bring the fighters to the fans and let's pack these arenas?
It's essential. It's so important. And it was one of my main goals with PFL Europe was to make sure that, even down to the very first fight on the card, the fans are showing up because they're excited for these matchups. That there are no, no free spots on the card. Every single spot on a fight card's valuable, and every single fight on the card should speak to the fans in attendance as well as the ones that are watching around the world. I always say this, right? If ever I'm watching an event on TV and the atmosphere looks incredible there, that's what makes me want to be at the event. It's not the fights. Like, the fights instigate the good energy out of the crowd, but I can watch good fights at home. It's the energy in the arena that makes me want to be in the arena. And that's what we got in Pittsburgh. That's what we've had across Europe with the 10,000 seat sellouts that we've had with Patrick Habarora and Doumbé and Lazy King on the card. Like, those events, they create an atmosphere that fans watching through the TV want to be a part of. And I think, with the Pittsburgh event, you got that energy through the screen on fight night. I've watched it back. The crowd were great. Even when Dalton got knocked out and Impa was doing his dance celebration, the crowd straight away are like, well, man, it was a great fight and you won, bro. Congratulations. It was just good energy all the way through. And it's the most important thing for me is that energy coming through on the TV. So the fans at home can see how excited the fans in attendance are to be there. And I think, it works both ways. You get a great crowd, you get great fights. You get great fights, you have a great crowd. Most important thing is the energy of the atmosphere in the room is coming through the TV.
Absolutely. And sir, I will wrap it up with this, and I appreciate you making the time for this. I love the fact that we started this year. What is the fight or the storyline you're most interested in coming into Chicago here April 11th?
Man, well, I mean, obviously we've talked about a lot of the really interesting ones, so I'll put another one out there that is potentially flying under the radar a little bit. That could be an absolute bloodbath, and that's Gabriel Braga against Chaden Lealoha. Both of these guys, they're just the front foot fighters. They're moving forward all the time. There's a lot of violence in both of their minds. And yesterday, of all the face-offs that we did, when those two guys came together, obviously Chaden is, he's making his PFL debut. He's had experiences across a variety of different shows, including the Contenders. Every single time he gets in there, he fights his heart out. And you have to say the same thing with Gabriel Braga. Coming in to win or lose, it doesn't matter. He's coming in to fight. And the energy between the two of them at the face-offs yesterday was palpable. And Braga just stared Chaden Lealoha in the eyes and he said, "Let's put on a show." And he just made the hairs stand up on the back of my neck, because you know what that means when he says that. It's like, let's put on a show. It's like, let's punch each other in the face as hard as we can until someone falls over. So that's the fight that might be a sleeper on the card for me.
I absolutely love it. He is the voice of the PFL. And Dan, doing between rounds now, I absolutely love it. A great sit down with John Martin, and everything that you're doing here with the PFL, I absolutely love, including this show. It is an absolute honor. I will tell you every single time, even if you're sick of it. It is fight week. We are here in Chicago. We're both here in Chicago. You can catch Dan Hardy on the broadcast and everything that he's doing leading up to PFL Chicago and during the broadcast here, April 11th, Wintrust Arena. Dan, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, brother. I'll speak to you again very soon.
This is the PFL Preview Show.